Can you say, "This is Dr. Amanda Zelechoski"?
Why do we have to?
Just try it.
Oh, I can't.
Deep breath. Okay.
This is Dr. Amanda Zelechoski. Lindsay Malloy. Ah!
Now, wait, say Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
No, come back.
This is Dr. Lindsay Malloy. Welcome to the Paternal Podcast.
One more time.
And then after that, can we have a candy after?
No.
Please, Mommy.
Okay, ready?
Pandemic Parenting Podcast.
Excellent.
All right, we're doing this thing, right?
We're doing it.
Okay. Welcome to the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. I'm Dr. Lindsay Malloy.
And I'm Dr. Amanda Zelechoski. We are two psychologists, scholars, and moms, and together we're the co-founders of Pandemic Parenting.
We're here to share science-based research and to help all who care for kids navigate this challenging time together.
In this first episode, we want to introduce ourselves, introduce our work as Pandemic Parenting. We're going to share some of the best research and advice out there that we've held on to during the pandemic. And we're going to talk about growth and how we think about growth during these difficult times.
Excellent. So I guess we can start off with just who we are. I, Lindsay, am a mom of two. So I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old who were 2 and 4 at the start of the pandemic in sort of March 2020. And I'm also a professor, an associate professor of psychology. My specialization's in developmental psychology. And I do research on children's memory and really children's functioning and involvement in the legal system.
And I, Amanda, am also a psychologist. I'm also an associate professor of psychology. My specialty areas are primarily focused on trauma in the juvenile justice and criminal justice systems. I am also a mom. I have 3 kids, ages 11, 8, and 5. And yeah, I spend a lot of time teaching and thinking about a lot of these issues that I think we're going to dive into tonight.
In some ways, it seems a little weird that we both mentioned kind of specializing in trauma and involvement in, the legal or justice systems in some ways. So it might seem kind of strange that we're hosting a podcast on parenting. Neither of us research parenting per se, but it just sort of made sense in a multitude of different ways, I guess, for us to start this little adventure that we've been on for the last 8 months or so. I don't know if you want to explain, since it was your vision.
Yeah, how we came to be here talking about this exactly. So I think that Lindsay and I were both in similar situations just around this time a year ago. When the pandemic was coming, we sort of had this inkling, a lot of us did, obviously, that this is something coming our way. It could get pretty bad. And when you study, issues of adversity and child trauma and things like that, like we do, I think one of the rare things in our field is that, we don't usually know these things are coming. When you think about a lot of crises like 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, school shootings, we can study the aftermath of those things, but we don't know they're coming, obviously, before they do. So this was a really rare situation where we knew a crisis was headed our way, and there were ways to study that, kind of figure out how people were doing right before it happened, right as it was happening, and then, it happened. And so we both sort of dove in with our respective research labs and colleagues to do studies on this. Partly for me, selfishly, it was, I didn't know how I was going to get through this. Being a working parent, having my kids home around the clock all of a sudden, still trying to do my job and fulfill all my responsibilities. So I was pretty worried about how tense things were going to get in my house. And I knew lots of other people were. And when things get tense in homes, that's when we know things like child maltreatment rates tend to skyrocket. So that was really what sort of motivated me to do some research on this. And that was kind of the start, which, we can talk more about the organization, but why did you do the study that you did?
Well, I guess I'm, as someone who studies children's memory, I was very interested from the get-go in how kids were going to experience this and how eventually, look back on it and think about it and how they would feel about it, what they would remember about it, maybe versus how us as adults were sort of, encoding and remembering that this weird experience, which of course I thought was going to last a few weeks, and now here we are. And so that was really my motivation. So let's start a study, let's get some initial data on how these kids and families are coping, and let's also look at how parents are talking to their kids about COVID-19 and how that might affect how kids are coping and how they remember this experience. And so our study was really focused on family communication about COVID-19, but then it just sort of kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're still looking at this. And that's really one of the big reasons we started Pandemic Parenting, was to try to get research to parents directly. The findings that we knew were going to be coming out of our own labs, but out of lots and lots of people's labs, because we are not the only psychologists or social scientists who sort of took their focus and dove in with studies as this was beginning last year. So we really wanted to have a way of getting that science, that research to parents directly, because that's kind of a rare thing these days.
Yeah, for sure. I was really worried in my study about parent stress. I mean, that was the thing I was particularly focused on. And so I think we both were learning things from these studies pretty quickly, and just felt like they could be helpful to families and parents right now. And so so last summer, we dove in, we decided to figure out a way to get this into the hands of the people who really need it right now in accessible ways. We've been bringing in lots of experts to talk with us about their research. As you said, lots of people have been studying this from really interesting angles, everything from screen time to how the holidays look different and how that's going to impact families, what this has been like for single parents. So we've really been fortunate to have so many amazing experts join us for these conversations, to share with us what they've learned and what parents need to focus on most right now.
Yes, because we very quickly realized that not only would parents be interested in findings that were coming out about the pandemic and about how kids and families were coping with it and what was sort of quote unquote best for their kids, but also just the kind of regular everyday psychology stuff, right? What we know from clinical psych, from developmental psych, that could be useful for parents who don't have the time to go out and buy and read a 300-page book right now. Well, probably ever usually, but especially in the middle of the pandemic. And so how can you know that you're getting good, credible information? And also how can you get that in a sort of more bite-sized format and not something like committing to reading a whole textbook? And so we're really trying to do that work of pulling out the most relevant, interesting bits for parents and getting them to them directly. And so that has pushed us to do all of these webinars that are freely available on our website at pandemic-parent.org, but also start this podcast, because as a parent myself, I listen to a lot of podcasts because when I'm listening to a podcast, I can do lots of other things like, any number of multitasking that you have to do as a parent. And so that was kind of part of our hope here, is that this would be an accessible way to get information to parents.
Yeah, my favorite way to think about what we've been doing the last 8-9 months or so, and what we're doing with this podcast is, you have all these great parent books or websites or articles that you bookmarked or meant to, I know I need to get to those. And in the middle of the night, when you're trying to get a sleeping baby to sleep, or in the middle of the day when you're desperate to sort of pull your fighting kids apart, I just need an answer. Like, I don't have time to sit down and read that 300-page book. So I just need to quickly know what I need to do right now, or what's most important in this situation. And I think that's what we've been trying to do, is really distill down the most important takeaways from a lot of the science, a lot of the experts, to really just give those to people quickly. And like you said, in ways that they can just access while they're multitasking, while they have a quick minute in between other tasks. So that's our hope. That's what we've been doing. And that's what we're going to continue to do as long as it's helpful.
Yes, we'd like to, with this podcast, bring on other guest experts that we can cover, various topics with this. So that's, I think, one of our goals moving forward. But we've also had a lot of incredible guests on our webinars and put together lots of resources to pull from, like, our different video clips and such. But what do you think, Amanda, that you've kind of, from all of that content catalog sort of thing that we have at this point from all these different webinars we've done, what is some advice or recommendations that you hold on to? Because of course, even though we're psychologists, we were we are not experts in some of the topics that we have had, like sibling conflict, or so we've been right there alongside you, you know, taking notes and trying to figure out how to make these things work for our own families.
Yeah. And we're also not perfect parents by any stretch.
What?
And that, exactly. Or don't tell my kids that. So yeah, we've been learning a lot of things right along with all of the pandemic parents, you know, who've joined us for a lot of these conversations. So I think for me, one of the things I've pulled away that, you know, from one of our earliest webinars that I keep coming back to again and again, I find myself telling friends and colleagues, reminding them again and again, is the advice we got from Dr. Bruce Perry, who joined us, you know, a number of months ago, to talk about how to build resilience, both in us as parents and in our kids. And, you know, one of the things he reminded us several times in that conversation was how at the end of the day, what is most important is that kids feel safe and loved, that we're getting so distracted and so worried about all of, you know, the different ways we're beating ourselves up as parents. And are kids having too much of this and not enough of this? And, you know, what are all the ways I'm screwing my kids up right now, or the decisions that I'm making aren't right? And he said they need to feel safe and loved. So all of these other things, you know, whether it's remote learning we're worried about, or screen time, or lack of social connection to their friends, you know, are we doing our best to make them feel safe and to make them feel loved and connected right now? And that's as much as we can really be asking of ourselves and of our kids, because that's what's most important, is going to help all of our resilience in this. So that's been one that I've really held on to. What about for you?
Same. I mean, that one definitely resonated. And I feel like this pandemic has really stripped down, you know, kind of to the bare bones of things in many ways. Of, you know, some of the decisions I used to stress over seem so silly and pointless now. And really coming back to those two things over and over again. I think it's great too that, you know, after we had Bruce Perry on our webinar, he's now doing, you know, he just did an interview with Oprah. So obviously that was, you know, the result of our pandemic parenting. Definitely. So we were just so lucky to have him come on and talk with us. That was amazing. And I think related to what he was saying, but also what, you know, John Comer, who was on when we discussed screen time and who's done lots of research looking at the aftermath of various disasters. He's got a lot of research on kids' reactions to the Boston Marathon bombing, for example, and other, you know, really traumatic events, is the importance of predictability and routines in kids' lives. And even for, you know, from the very youngest up until, you know, even the teenagers. And that is something that I remember when the pandemic first kind of started and people were posting these adorable homeschool schedules on social media and stuff. And I just thought, like, you know, I'm not going to be able to do that, or I'm not. But it really quickly became evident how important that kind of thing was going to be. Maybe not that exact thing, like a homeschooling schedule, but how important the kids having predictability in their lives, having some sense of control and certainty and a routine when everything in their lives had been upended and changed so suddenly. And so I definitely noticed differences just, you know, anecdotally with my own kids once I implemented more structure in our days. And so that was something that really, really hit home with me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I even noticed that when my husband and I, like when we'd have our different sort of days where we were trading who was working and who was managing the kids, and, you know, the way we each did our schedules were quite different from one another. And the kids were aware of that and would say, well, wait a minute, yesterday with Dad, this is how we did it. And why are you doing it in this order? And so, like, even for that, we had to try to kind of get on the same page for them, even though we might have, you know, usually done things a little differently. So so I think that predictability is really a big piece of this. So there've been, so many lessons we've learned. I'm sure we're going to talk about, you know, more of those in coming conversations, and just have more conversations with, you know, additional experts that we're looking forward to bringing on the podcast. Mm-hmm. So I'm sort of thinking about, in addition to, you know, the experts we've learned from, some of the biggest lessons I think you and I both feel we've learned have been from other parents, have been from questions they've submitted, you know, comments they've made either live or sent in to us, things that are on their hearts and minds that they really want us to tackle. So I was, wondering what sort of stuck with you that as far as stories or comments or that we've heard from parents.
Yeah, one thing that really stands out was actually in one of our most recent webinar was Adriana in Ontario, who asked, it was just how are we supposed to do this? It was our webinar focused on working moms, and it was just such a simple question, but I felt it, like, wait a second. Yeah. How are we supposed to do this? And so we had some great discussions with Amy Knopf and Jess Calarco about, well, okay, we're not actually supposed to do this. This is not sustainable. This is not something that you can actually have balance in. And I think just having that permission to realize it's okay that it's not going very well, because it's actually completely unmanageable and not sustainable to think that it's going to, and you're not supposed to be doing this.
Yeah, I think it is that those feelings that, are evoked in the comments that people have sent to us, and, questions and concerns and topics they want us to tackle. And what I think maybe we're most proud of in this work is just providing a community for other parents to know that they're not alone, and that's not just in our live webinars, but in all of our various social media, channels. There's quite a significant contingent on Facebook and Twitter and, Instagram and LinkedIn that are commenting and following. And what we hear from people is, it's so nice to know I'm not alone. And that's one of the things that stuck with me is Jesus in California, who had reached out and said, it's really been refreshing to jump into these webinars because I know I'm not alone in my feelings. Other parents are struggling too and don't have it figured out either. And it was like, yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do is, peel away the perfect Instagram images people think, they're seeing, and then think like, why am I the only one who doesn't have it figured out? Am I the only parent who's still struggling a year later? And, when we hear comments like this, it reminds me of pretty early in the pandemic, I needed to channel my frustration and grief in some way. And I love to be creative and do crafty things. And so I was sewing a lot of masks right along with this huge community, in my geographic area, all these people that were sewing masks. And so we were part of this huge Facebook group. And I just remember, the only time I could do it was like very late at night once my kids were finally in bed, and just the solidarity of knowing like there were all these other, primarily women I knew in this group, up late at night, cranking away on their sewing machines too, all of us trying to help. And that's what I felt with our pandemic parenting community too, is like knowing, when I'm up in the middle of the night working and responding to emails at 1 a.m. because that's the only time I can do it amidst everything else. So are thousands upon thousands of other parents trying to manage this too in the ways that work for them. And so I've just felt really humbled and grateful for the opportunity to know that we are building a community and that we have provided that solidarity and support that people are feeling, knowing, all right, other parents are struggling like I am, but we're trying to figure it out and lift each other up. At Pandemic Parenting, we're committed to sharing our expertise and research in ways that are immediately accessible and useful to families. As part of our efforts to sustain and expand this work, Lindsay and I are also available for virtual speaking engagements at your business, organization, PTO, and more. We want to help you and those who you work with, grow with, and raise your children with have the chance to do so in an environment that fosters and supports your mental health. Some of the topics we enjoy speaking on include parenting during the pandemic, the impact of trauma on children and families, children's development, the mental health impact of COVID-19 on employees, and more. If you or your organization are interested in potentially collaborating, please reach out to us for availability and pricing through the Request a Speaker form on our website at www.pandemic-parent.org/contact.
Hearing from what other parents were going through also, made me realize that these are really kind of developmentally oriented problems that people are having, that, all parents really are struggling. And a lot of times you'll see people say, oh, well, it's so much easier for me because mine are older, but it doesn't seem to really be that way. I mean, everybody has their sets of challenges associated with different age groups. I mean, we did a whole webinar focused on teen mental health specifically because we were getting so many questions about, okay, well, what about teens? And of course, Amanda and I have younger kids. And so a lot of our bias or focus or what have you has been on the younger age groups. And some of Amanda's research did show that in some ways, the parents of those younger kids were stressed more. But every parent is struggling right now, it seems. And that, you really have to think about, it really depends on the ages and characteristics of the children in the family, and of the parents too, of course.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The worries look different. The kinds of struggles look different, especially for parents of older kids. We've started to recently hear from a lot of parents just worried about, falling behind academically. Like, what is this going to mean for my child and their opportunities? And just this sort of worry about the long-term effects. Whereas I think a lot of our conversations with parents of younger kids, it's just that day-to-day management. My child's emotional fluctuation that I'm trying to manage amidst everything, just supervision and making sure everybody's safe and occupied and all those kinds of things during the day. So yeah, so I agree. The struggles look different, but it doesn't mean that parents of kids of different ages are not struggling just because their kids might be at a different developmental stage.
Now that we are kind of 1 year on or so, if we want to think about growth during this time, and not to put, we don't want to put like a toxic positivity spin on it or anything, but thinking about how we've grown as parents, and just in general, how people grow during difficult and traumatic times.
Yeah, I think a couple things like this come up. For me, I think a lot about, as a trauma researcher, the idea of grief, and because grief and growth go hand in hand. And so, a lot of times people think, like you said, oh, when we have these losses, let's just go right to silver linings, and here's all the ways I've grown from this, or, whatever, shown resilience. And it's like, well, hold on, there's a lot that we're grieving. And so I really think we need to think about the role that grief has played in this, and how actually grief can lead to growth because they go hand in hand. So grief's really this inevitable part of life. It's something that we're going to experience a lot. We've most definitely experienced it a lot throughout the pandemic, and just in different ways. People tend to think about grief as always meaning, the loss of a loved one because of a death. But think about all the different things we've lost, over the last year, and that our kids have lost, activities, things that are really important to them, milestones they were supposed to meet. I think one of the things that, as we think about growth, it's moving from that, all right, we sort of acknowledge and recognize all of the different ways we've experienced grief, our kids have experienced grief, and we've allowed ourselves to feel the pain of that loss so that we now can grow from it. And so I think that's been it's going to be an important piece for all of us before we can get to the growth, is acknowledging the loss, letting those feelings be there as they have needed to fluctuate throughout the last year. And I think this 1 year milestone is a big one for people. Anniversaries like this tend to be these stark reminders of, wow, I can't believe we've been at this for a year. And now we're about to hit, anniversaries of all of those things we didn't get to do. And so that's important to sort of honor, as I said, and recognize before you can start to move to, wow, here's all the ways we've grown from this. So I think that's a big piece of it. But it's also thinking about how our parenting has evolved. And I love the way that you think and talk about, parenting as sort of a verb. So I wonder if you could talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think about growth like gardening, right? Like, it reminded me of the gardening metaphor that when we were preparing for the mom guilt webinar, and I was kind of looking at research on parenting and what, historically has parenting been like, and read this great, I think it was called like a Manifesto against parenting or something. It was a Wall Street Journal article with a really famous developmental psychologist, Alison Gopnik, but she talked about how it wasn't really until like the 70s that the idea of parenting, or parenting as a verb, really started to be thrown around more. And now we hear it all the time, right? So parenting is something that you do, almost like another full-time job, as opposed to something that you are, like, I am a parent. No, I engage in parenting. It's like this big thing. So her article was really great in thinking about parenting, not as a carpenter who's sort of I've got to get all the right pieces together and build this child, like sort of manufacture this product that I'm going to say, this is a successful product, like, introducing my child, this product. But to think about more as being a gardener and cultivating, that child and giving the child space to grow and to become the person that they are, or that they're, supposed to be. And that takes a lot of the pressure off the parent, because, it's not about like, well, I have to do the exact right things, and I have to get all the right ingredients in place in order to create this, this product. So it's just a different way of thinking about it that I think resonates with me, especially in thinking about growth and, the child growing as well as you growing as a parent and in your parenting styles.
Yeah, it's definitely felt more verb to me this past year than now. Like I have done so much more parenting around the clock, it feels like, than I have ever done.
Yes.
With all this time at home. So yeah, so it just makes me wonder, like, has your view then of parenting changed over the last year throughout the pandemic?
I think it has. I think it's had to. I mean, I think that I, in some ways, didn't really have a choice but to kind of adapt some of my thinking or change some of my thinking. We've talked quite extensively about this idea of good enough parenting. And I think that's, I've tried to come back to that, like that, this idea that you can do quite a lot of harm by being very bad at parenting. And by very bad, I mean, abusive, neglectful, but you're not going to do that much good by being the quote unquote super parent, right? Like the Pinterest perfect, Instagram friendly parent that isn't actually going to have that, much of a positive effect, or maybe even not any positive effect on kids. And so you really just need to be good enough is what the philosophy is. And I think that that's something we can really hold on to, hopefully right now, especially because it's hard, if not impossible, to be the super parent right now. So you got to kind of let yourself off the hook on that.
Yeah, I think for me, my views have I think it's that I always knew this stuff intellectually, I guess, especially because of, our training and the ways we were taught to think about parents, the ways we teach others about parenting and what's important. But man, when you're thrust into it, like one of the things that I felt like really just was in my face a lot this year was how I need to parent my kids differently. Like I need to meet each of them where they're at and sort of track that and stay attuned to that instead of us making decisions, about the kids as a collective unit. I had to start to sort of figure out, okay, well, this child's struggling in this way. And here's maybe, what I need to do to meet his need or advocate for him like this, or, whatever, put this kind of structure. Whereas this kid is struggling in this way. And so I need to approach this differently. And so that became really important when we were all home all day long together under the same roof of trying to meet each person's needs a little bit differently, which might mean making different decisions for each of them. So I think trying to be sort of instead of, like you said, the perfect parent, as I thought about what good enough parenting looked like for me this year, it was, how do I sort of be the right parent for this kid right now, kind of in this moment? And that didn't always look the same. Like it could change week to week. And, and a lot of times I screwed it up, and then I'd have to come back and say, okay, well, let's figure out what didn't work there. So that helped me a lot to kind of think about each of them as individuals, and then, me as an individual too. Like, when do I need to tap out for an hour? And I was so, sort of course, lucky and privileged to have a partner helping me do this. And so I could tap out for 10 minutes here or there if I needed to, or he could too, if he was at his wit's end. So that was a big thing of just trying to parent each of them and meet each of them where they were in those moments. But also, P.S., that's exhausting. Like that sort of emotion regulation, or we've talked about it as co-regulation, all day long, every day for everybody. This sort of pandemic parenting dance, that we've written about in our work for pandemic parenting, of just what that looks like. It's exhausting.
Yes, I definitely feel that. I've never been a good dancer. So, there's that as well. I think so. I can't even remember something that you just said reminded me of this idea too, of that you said very early on. I think it was our very first webinar about making decisions, and that was it works until it doesn't. And that's something that really has stuck out to me the whole time, and something that has influenced my parenting, because I tend to catastrophize, if that's a word. Like, okay, well, if I say yes to the screen time today because I need to get through this meeting, then what does that mean for tomorrow and next week and next month? It's like, no, actually, let's just get through right now. And I think that, that's what might work for me today or this week, but it doesn't mean that it has to stick. We can change things, we can make new decisions, and having to sort of live in the moment a little bit more and parent in the moment and give up some of the control that I like to have has been a big part of it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And things have been changing so much throughout this. So I think, that's been a saving grace sort of mantra for me, that idea of things work until they don't. And we're so used to making decisions that have more permanence, or maybe feel like they have more permanence. And so, this feeling within the pandemic of like, none of us know what's coming in a week or in a month, or how long this is going to go on, or, what sort of decisions or pivots we might have to continue making. So that was the best way I could kind of make peace with, like, well, I'm making the decision based on the information I have right now in front of me. In 3 days, that could look quite different. And so, this works until it doesn't, which, that's something that we haven't even talked about yet. This whole idea of decision fatigue, that's been a big psychological science concept we've come back to again and again in our conversations with pandemic parents, because people are exhausted by it. And it's just this relentless need to make decision after decision to keep ourselves safe, to keep our family safe, that don't have clear answers. And that is just pretty taxing on all of our, mental health and stress levels.
And even the simple decisions, because of the decision fatigue of so many decisions. And a lot of us have had our kids home for months and months when they would normally be in school. And so there's decisions like, okay, what are we going to do today again? and what am I going to feed them again? Or rather, like, what am I going to put in front of them and then just get rid of a few hours later when they don't eat it or whatever? It's just like one thing after another. And because there are so few options, for many of us, it's like, what are we going to do this weekend? Well, let's pick which trail we're going to hike, because that's pretty much all we have to do. So I think, even the little decisions start to feel big and start to feel like they're too much when you're having that decision fatigue. So, okay, well, so that's as parents, but how do you think as a human being, how do you feel like, if we're talking about growth, that you've grown during this pandemic?
It is interesting to think about, all the things, as we were talking about before, that, we've lost or haven't gone the way we've wanted to. But I do think there are a lot of things we're learning about ourselves in this. I definitely feel that about, me. Like, when I stop for a second and think about the last year, I'm just sort of speechless at like what we've all been able to manage and get through and figure out and adapt. I just think we're an amazingly resilient species. And I know that that's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it really, this year is an example of that. Now, there are lots of ways people are truly suffering still and will for a long time, but we've also just found these ways to figure it out as best we can, I think, especially when it comes to trying to manage our kids. So for me, I think the ability to adapt is pretty amazing. And to think about, what I've been able to do, what my family's been able to overcome. We've had a lot of loss the last year, like everybody else. And so how we've navigated that has been kind of amazing. And I think for our kids to get to see our resilience as parents and how we work through these things. I mean, that's an important lesson. Resilient kids, we're not just born that way. We have to model it for them. We have to, show, here's how mommy gets through something really difficult. They're getting to see that on a daily basis, how we're navigating some of these really challenging things. So I've been grateful for, my kids to get to see, well, mom and dad do get stressed out and things don't go the way we want, or we have to change our decision because, this other factor came into play. So that's something to just sort of feel like I've been able to figure it out, and it hasn't been pretty. And it has been relentless, as you like to say a lot. And I've made a lot of mistakes and dropped a lot of balls this year, but we're still standing, we're still here. And that's felt pretty amazing.
Whenever I would get stressed about something, I would have my sort of go-to event that for a long time it was okay in like my internal dialogue, right? Okay, you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Like you can do this, stupid work task or whatever it is. You can testify in this case or whatever I'm stressed about. Like you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And then it was like, you had an almost 10-pound baby. Like you can do this. And so now I just think this is going to be the thing, like eventually, hopefully, that we can look back on and say, okay, remember that time you thought the kids were going to be home for 2 weeks and you were stressed about how you were going to get through it. And then that turned into 6 months. And, somehow, some way. And I read the Glennon Doyle book, Untamed, this past summer. Well, actually, I listened to it on audiobook because that's the only way that I can read books these days, but same thing. And, the line that she says over and over again, right? Like we can do hard things. And I whisper that to my daughter a lot, like when I'm dropping her off at daycare these days, because she's not very happy about it. And there's a lot of tears. And so I'm always saying to her, like, okay, we can do hard things. We can do hard things. And it doesn't mean that it's fun. And it doesn't mean that, it's going well, like you said, but we can do them. And we have been.
Yeah. And I think one of the really interesting things is you talk about, how we've evolved and grown is going to be in the coming months. I've been thinking a lot about how it's starting to be spring, we're starting to change seasons, and just what is growth going to look like in the months ahead as we hopefully continue to slowly move out of this pandemic. People talk about sort of returning to to normal or what that's going to look like. And I think as a human species, we've been spending the year trying to stay away from each other. And that's kind of counter to the way we're made. So I think it's going to be really interesting to figure out how we're going to slowly find our way back to each other. And I just think it's neat to be thinking about that in spring, because spring is full of things that happen naturally like that, right? I've just been thinking a lot about how we're starting to see flower buds kind of poking up through the ground, or animals that have been hibernating, that they peek out to scope things out. Like, is it time to come out? Is it safe? And that's kind of what we're going to need to do to condition ourselves back to being together. And that's going to be pretty amazing growth, but it's going to be hard, right? We've conditioned ourselves to stay away and that it is unsafe to be with people. So how we're going to have to evolve and grow and find our way back to each other is going to be really important.
And how we're going to show our kids who have been, getting all of these warnings and wearing their masks and, stay back from other kids at the park and all this kind of stuff. How we're going to get them back to hopefully eventually, allowing for that kind of thing. So that's going to be interesting. I mean, for my 3-year-old, I don't think she probably remembers a time at this point that was before, in the before times. So I think it's going to be very interesting for kids of all different ages, like to see. And I think that's a topic that, we're really hopeful to be able to cover in an upcoming podcast with people with relevant expertise. So maybe we should talk about like what's next for pandemic parenting.
Yeah. So I think we're really excited to grow as an organization. If you would have asked Lindsay and I, 8 months ago when we started this, like, would we still be here doing this? And what will it look like? I don't think we ever would have predicted that it would be where we are now, which is, an entire 501c3 nonprofit organization with this community of thousands and thousands of parents all over the world who have found their way to us and to this community for these resources, for really credible and accessible information. So we're so grateful to be continuing to do the work, and we will continue to do it as long as it's helpful to people. So, this podcast, for example, evolved out of the webinars we've been doing. We've done 15, full live webinars that you can find on our website. Again, everything is always free, accessible to anyone and everyone. You can find those webinars along with about 100 of these snack clips. So 1 to 2 minute clips of the highlights from each of these webinars, some of the best tips and tricks and resources that our experts have shared with us. So, when you're sitting and you have 5 minutes scrolling your phone and you just want a quick bit of advice, or you're Googling, what is quantity versus quality screen time for my kid? I mean, there's a 2-minute video we have for you there from some of the, world's experts on these issues. So, we're going to be revisiting a lot of these conversations that we've already had, bringing back some of those popular guests that folks have asked for more from, and bringing on a lot of other new people for future episodes of this podcast. We'll continue to make things, digestible and accessible and quick and easy and credible. Continue to provide as many resources as we can. We're going to continue to ask you what topics you want to hear about, because we want to try to stay on top of, what are, again, the things on the hearts and minds of parents right now.
Right. We have so many questions that have come in at the during the webinars that we weren't able to get to. So we'd like to try to, like Amanda said, bring people back and ask them those questions and just be able to hopefully get to as many of those as we can. But you can also submit your questions too. So we definitely want to hear from you and see what you'd like us to cover.
So as we sort of wrap up, I guess, what's one piece of advice or encouragement you want to leave with listeners today, Lindsay?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I cannot remember where I read this, and maybe you'll remember, but there was some sort of meme or something going around years ago, and I'm just kicking myself that I can't remember, but it was something like, when your child looks into the audience at the school concert, like they aren't looking for the perfect mom, they're looking for their mom. I just had, before the pandemic, had the very first kind of school concert experience with my older child. And we had that moment, where he's scanning the whole big crowded gym and I'm, trying to get his attention, and every other parent in the room is doing that. And every kid up on the stage is doing that. They're all looking to lock eyes with their parent. But again, they're not looking for they don't want the perfect mom necessarily. They're looking for their mom or their dad or their grandma or whoever it is. And so it helps me to just keep that in mind, that we have this special relationship, and, we're doing our best, and so are our kids right now.
And they're safe and loved. That's right.
Yes.
So I think that a lot of times as parents, we worry about so much, and we worry about what our kids are going to look back and remember about all of these different phases, or about, aspects of their childhood. And I think that people will be pretty surprised about what their kids, no matter what ages they are, remember about this year, this year that we stayed home. And what we worry about and stress about as parents impacting them is going to be very different, I think, than what they will look back and remember about it. In my case, for example, my husband travels usually for his job, and he's gone most weeks, 3, 4, 5 days a week. Well, my kids have had him home for this year. They've never had this much time uninterrupted with him, having lunch with them in the middle of the day, playing board games in the middle of the afternoon. I think the things that we stress and worry about, people will be surprised about what their kids remember. And we've had several experts reminding us that too. I think about when Robyn Fivush was here with us, talking about this for the holidays, and how we stress so much about trying to create these perfect holidays for our kids. And she reminded us, what do you remember about your childhood holidays? It wasn't that the, dinner was burned, or the pie came out perfectly, or the perfect present was under the tree. It was the time that you spent with family, those really warm memories of spending time together. And so I want parents to have grace for themselves, that none of us know what we're doing. There's no playbook for this. And I think that you're going to be surprised about what your kids remember about this time, as opposed to all of the things that you've been worried and stressed about.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Pandemic Parenting Podcast. Make sure to hit follow or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you're listening on to be notified of future episodes. We'd also love to connect with you on social media. Look for our blue and yellow logo when you search Pandemic Parenting on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube, and you'll find us. Or follow the links in the show notes.
Let us know what you think of this episode by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Your 5-star review helps us move up the charts to reach even more parents and caregivers. If you have a specific question or topic you'd like us to address in a future episode, let us know. You can email info@pandemic-parent.org and mention podcast in the subject line.
And this podcast isn't all we do, by the way. Pandemic Parenting is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free science-based resources for parents and all who care for children while navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. To learn more about our organization and access our extensive extensive library of webinars, videos, blogs, and more, visit www.pandemic-parent.org.
Lastly, this show wouldn't be possible without supporters like you. Lindsay and I donate our time to this podcast, but we do have an incredible team working behind the scenes to make this all happen. If you'd like to support the show beyond leaving your 5-star review, visit www.pandemic-parent.org/support and donate today.
Thanks for listening. Hope you can join us next time.